of our community. All your meaningful interactions may be with your fellow, not only Muslims, but your fellow Shia, and in Baitul Ilm in particular. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes people who have homeschools and they raise their kids in a homeschool environment, this is one of the pitfalls. It's not a necessary correlation, but sometimes what happens if they're not conscious about making sure that their children are also, in addition to getting excellent education, excellent care and love from their parents, if they're not conscious about making sure that they interact with others, then they can become insular. They can become kind of have their own culture, their own language, their own way of interacting, and then when they are put into an environment where there are others, then they may not be capable, only because there was not sufficient thought put into how to interact. Same with our Islamic school. Now, mashallah, we have a strong Islamic school and it's growing, and this is one of the challenges that the Islamic school is going to face as we go forward, because the kids are not interacting in a public school environment where they're interacting with all kinds of people, all kinds of teachers, all kinds of problems and peers. They're interacting with their fellow Shia, with Shi'i teachers, a good strong environment with an alim at the top, and from good families where Islam and Ahlul Bayt and all these very important values are at the core of their existence. So it's wonderful on one hand, but one of the challenges of having that advantage, which has to be adjusted for and accounted for, is that you can become insular. Now, when you interact with someone who's not Shi'i, not Muslim, are you awkward? Do you know how to express yourself? Do you know how to interact with them in a way that is comfortable, that is productive, that is meaningful? Or do you feel like, oh no, there are others, I don't know how to deal with them, let me pull away? So how we interact with others at all these different levels is a very important part of our life, and something that we have to put some conscious thought into to make sure that we are able to interact with people in a positive way, in a good way. We're able to maintain our values and not compromise them or lose them when we're dealing with others, so that we can be a force to call people towards Allah and influence them towards Allah. And all of that only happens if we are very strong in our deen, but also conscious about how we interact with others. Recite wa salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Last summer I came across this idea. There's a very important alim that we have, one of our contemporaries, Sheikh Muhammad Ali Shumali. And I interacted with him a little bit in the UK, and then I came across one of his new books, which has a new idea. I think I expressed it in one of my talks earlier, but it's an important idea. I've been mulling over it for the past year and trying to put some of the ideas into practice as well. And so I wanted to share some of my reflections on his, I think it's a new idea, it's definitely a very refreshing idea. When we interact with others, think of interfaith interactions, for instance. Typically, when we interact in an interfaith environment, we have one of a few ideas in our mind for why we are doing it and what we hope to get out of it. So if we interact with non-Muslims, for instance, in an interfaith environment, maybe in the back of my mind is that I am hoping to influence them. I'm hoping to, sow some seeds so that they will come towards Islam and maybe become Muslim. And so then that goal, if that's my goal in my interaction with them, it is going to influence the way I interact with them. If my goal is to call them towards Islam, it doesn't come off very well if I make that very clear up front. If I come to a church gathering, for instance, an interfaith gathering at a church, and I say, my goal here is that inshallah all of you become Muslim. That's not going to go over very well. That's not it's not going to set the tone very nicely for an interaction that's positive. So what happens, if that's my goal, oftentimes we end up becoming duplicitous. We're two-faced. Because we have a stated goal, which is interfaith and getting together and breaking bread together and sharing ideas and let's get to know each other. That's what we say. But if in my heart, I really want you to convert, that's my agenda, then there's a two-facedness about it. I'm not honest in how I'm interacting with you. I'm manipulating. I'm always looking for opportunities. How can I say, what can I say? How can I, plant the seed? How can I make them realize they're wrong? How can I make sure that they know that I'm right? And I'm always in this kind of strategic mindset as I'm interacting with the person. And it's not a very sincere and straightforward interaction that I can have with that person. Another goal a person might have in interacting in an interfaith environment with others is that they simply want to make things better. There's animosity, there are misunderstandings, and I want those things to go away so at least they don't hate us as much. At least they have they see that I'm also a normal person, I have a normal religion, and their hatred will be less for me. That's also a goal, and it's sometimes an important goal depending on the environment. What Sheikh Shumali's thoughts and what his book, the book I'm referring to, is called Unity of God and Unity in God. And so what he talks about in this book is that there's a more meaningful interaction that we can have with people that is very sincere, and there's no need for manipulation, there's no need for strategizing. It's simply continuing the same struggle that each one of us has, which is to get closer to Allah, and you can extend this to other people as well. So for instance, if I'm dealing with a Christian, if I'm interacting with a Christian through interfaith or through personal experience, Christians are also monotheistic. If you ask them, are you a polytheist, are you an idol worshiper? They will say no, we worship one God, we're a monotheist. That's an important tenet of their faith. Now yes, they have a trinity, many of them believe in a trinity and they have this conception. They themselves struggle with this. They themselves don't really know how to even articulate what the Trinity means and how it's compatible with monotheism. And this is not a new struggle, this is a struggle that's been there from the very beginning of this Pauline Christianity, the Christianity of Paul, which was a deviation from the teachings of Isa alayhi salam and his rightful successor Peter. And it's been something they've had to struggle with. And they've had councils upon councils. The Council of Nicaea was one of these, where they finally came up to a point where they could articulate what they meant by the Trinity. But it's been a constant struggle for Christians throughout the ages. And even now, a Christian who's thoughtful will say, I believe there's one God. We have this idea of the Trinity, and they'll try to find some way to reconcile the two. That these are three aspects of God, three faces of God. They have different ways of articulating it, and they themselves will say it doesn't make any sense. It's not a mathematical truth, of course. That 1 does not equal 3, they understand that. But what they'll say to solve the problem for themselves is that this is not a matter that the human mind, that logic can address. God is beyond logic, He is beyond the limits of our mind. Our mind is limited, that's why we can't understand Him in His reality. But He is 1, He's 3, and all of this, I don't understand it, but it's true. That's kind of the solution that they come up with themselves, for themselves. But my point is that they hold fast to the tenet that God is one. And that's important. That's an important commonality between us. In the verse I recited, قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ تَعَالَوْا إِلَى كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ أَلَّا نَعْبُدَ إِلَّا اللَّهَ وَلَا نُشْرِكَ بِهِ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَتَّخِذَ بَعْضُنَا بَعْضًا أَرْبَابًا مِنْ دُونِ اللَّهِ. We're told in Surah Al Imran to tell Ahlul Kitab, come to a common belief that is held by you and by us. Something that's common between you and us, and then it articulates it in 3 different ways. That we won't worship other than God, that we won't call on or consider or kind of imagine there to be any sharik, any partner for God, and that we won't take one another and other people, other human beings as arbab, as lords instead of God. There are 3 different articulations of this concept of tawheed that Allah is telling us. He's saying qul to the Prophet, and by extension to us, tell Ahlul Kitab to come to this common belief. Now, so the idea is, if I enter into a discussion with a Christian or any other, and I have animosity, I'm coming to debate, I'm coming to challenge, I'm coming to debunk, and I want to insist that you are Trinitarian, you believe that God is 3, and this is why you're wrong. If that's my starting point in the conversation, then what does that do to the other person? It puts them on the defensive. I'm pushing them further away from Tawheed. I'm insisting that no, you believe in the Trinity. and I'm making them more entrenched in their own false belief or the false articulation of a belief. And then I'm knocking them down and saying, this false belief that you do have, and I'm going to insist that you have, here's why it's wrong. Well, that kind of interaction isn't a very positive interaction. I'm putting them on the defensive, now I'm arguing with them, now I'm trying to make a point and prove something, and they're trying to now defend something, and it doesn't make for a very good conversation. It definitely doesn't open hearts, it doesn't open minds. I'm not in an open-minded attitude as I'm interacting with them because I already know what I want to prove and what I want to disprove. And I'm just after this one goal for why this is wrong and why you're wrong. And they're also on the defensive, so they're trying to figure out how can I defend myself, how can I defend my faith. So that kind of interaction is not a very fruitful interaction. A much more positive interaction is to say, you believe in one God, and I believe in one God. This is a very important tenet of both of our faiths. In fact, it's the central tenet of both of our faiths. Let's grow in that. Let's work on that. Let's think about it. Let's look at our text and discuss, what are the ramifications of this one God? Who is this one God that you and I both worship together? What does the biblical tradition say, and what does the Quranic tradition say? And focus on trying to understand God better, to know Him better, to know His attributes better, to know His oneness in particular better. And then the goal is, how can we all become better servants of Him? How can we know Him better, and how can we act in a way, live in a way that is pleasing to Him as our Creator? That's a common pursuit that I have with this other person who's also a faithful person. Now the interaction changes drastically. Now we're both on the same side, we're both working together. We're both trying to know the one God, we're both trying to worship that one God. And we're sharing and we're growing. The reality is that sometimes through these interactions, yes, we understand that we have the most updated religion, the most updated version of this deen that Allah has sent down to us, and it's more complex and more comprehensive. All of that's there. However, sometimes there are holes in our own understanding, our own practice of our deen that we only are attuned to when we interact with others. So again, if we're just in our own bubble, if there's some failing that we have, something that we missed as a community of Shia, it's there on the books, we know it's right, we know we're supposed to do it, but it's kind of fallen out of vogue and it's fallen out of practice amongst the Shia. Well, we're not going to ever be attuned to it because we all have the same hole. But when I interact with another faithful person from another tradition, either a Sunni, right, or another Shi'i from another sect, or a person from another religion, sometimes they are focused on certain aspects of the deen, of our deen, the deen that we know from Allah and Ahlul Bayt, but they've focused on it and they've practiced it in a way that eluded me. It was a hole, it was in my blind spot, I wasn't focused on it. So as an example, one of the very, problematic distinctions that we have, we, especially as Shia, we tend to have a very large distance from the Quran. This is a problem in Shi'i practice. Shia tend to be, amongst Muslims, they tend to be more distant from the Quran. We're worse at memorization, our tajweed is worse, we don't read it as regularly, we don't focus on the meaning, we don't have tafsir discussions in classes as much as, for instance, Ahlul Sunnah. And so when you interact with them, it reminds you that where is Quran in my practice? Why is Quran not as prominent in our masjid as followers of Ahlul Bayt as it is in people who are not following Ahlul Bayt? And it inspires us that I need to memorize Quran too. Why? How come all of my Sunni friends' kids have memorized multiple ajza of Quran? Some of them are hafiz of the entire Quran, and I don't know a single Shi'i from our community who's just hafiz of the Quran. When we know the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt have emphasized hifz of the Quran. So that's a hole, that's something in our blind spot we don't realize, and all of us are in the same level of ignorance and malpractice of our deen. All of us have failed in making our children huffaz, or first of all making ourselves huffaz, So we don't see it as a big failing. Like, that's the way Muslims are. Because every Muslim I know in Baitul Ilm, for instance, in my Shia community, every Muslim is like this. So I don't realize this is a failing. But now if I interact with others, then I realize, wait, they're doing something right that I wasn't doing. It's part of the deen. I'm not saying this is, the Ahlul Bayt forgot it, for instance, God forbid, and now someone else thought of it and they forgot it. No, we as followers of Ahlul Bayt missed this and didn't pick up on it, didn't make it a big part of our practice of the deen. And you can become realigned with your interaction, through your interaction with others. Or for instance, Christians, especially evangelical Christians, they're very attuned to reading the Bible and focusing on understanding it, looking for it to speak to them. Right? They have this idea that there's failings in this as well. They've kind of given up on tradition and scholarship and commentaries and history, kind of like the Salafis amongst the Muslims. But one of the good things that they do is they read the Bible regularly, and they read it not for tabarruk and for thawab, they read it to get guidance from it. Which of course is an Islamic concept as well. We're supposed to be reading Quran. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنِ. We're not supposed to just read the Quran. Sheikh Faizi is always focusing on this. It's not just for thawab and not just for tilawah and for someone who's died and now I have to read the Quran. That's the first time I've read it in the entire year because it's the first time someone's died. Not like that. But I should be reading it and reading it for understanding, for inspiration, for guidance. That's what it was sent down for. هُدًى لِلنَّاسِ. But we miss it sometimes. We're so focused on the thawab aspect of it and the ritual aspect of it that we may not be focusing on the meaning of it and the guidance that we derive from it. But when you interact with an evangelical Christian, you see how sincerely and how devotedly and how regularly and with what kind of attitude they approach their holy book, and how they say, I read this verse and it spoke to me, this is what it said to me. You realize that's actually what we're supposed to be doing too. I'm supposed to be reading the Quran too, not in Arabic only, but for understanding. So if I need to use a translation as a crutch, so be it. If I need a commentary to help me to understand it, also so be it. But I need to come away with an understanding that this verse is speaking to me. This is what I understand from the verse. Sometimes as Shia we're scared that if I interpret the verse, we have all these ahadith that say, if you do tafsir bir-ra'i, if you interpret the Quran based on your own understanding, then you're doing something wrong. You're imposing something on the Quran. Well, that's something different from what I just described. If I'm coming to the Quran and I'm reading it, this is Allah's guidance to me, and I understand something from the verse, I say, this is what I understand from the verse. Where is tafsir bir-ra'i in that? This is reading and understanding. That's just what a book does, and what a reader of a book does. Now it's one thing if I say, this is what the verse is saying, and I can authoritatively say, this is what God means in this verse. Now I better know what I'm talking about if I'm going to make that kind of a claim. But if I'm saying, this is what I understand from the verse, this is what I've understood, how can Allah fault me with that? That's exactly why He set down a book and said, read it and think about it, is to read it and think about it and understand something from it. So these interactions with others, for those who came in late, I'm talking about how we interact with other people, other Muslims who are not followers of Ahlul Bayt, other followers of other faiths or followers of no faith. But how we interact with people is a very big challenge that we have to struggle with. And so I outline these different ways, or let's say attitudes, that we might enter into a discussion with other people. One is to pin them down and convert them and argue with them. One is just to defend ourselves and say, look, I'm a Muslim, I'm a regular human being, I'm a normal person, you don't have to hate me. But a more meaningful approach to interacting with others is to just continue the same struggle that we all have as Muslims who are trying to do taslim, trying to submit to Allah. I need to know Allah better. I need to think about Him more. There's infinite ignorance on my part about God. No matter how much I know, what I don't know is always infinite. So my scope, my learning curve is infinitely asymptotical. Right? You can keep on learning, and there'll be no end. So I have an infinite path ahead of me to get closer to Allah, and everyone else has the same. So now when I interact with the other, Sunni or non-Muslim or whoever it may be, if I engage with them on this on this principle. Let's get closer to Allah. Let's know Him better. What are the attributes that the Bible talks about when it wants to describe God? And let's compare and contrast with the attributes that the Quran and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt put forward for Allah. Where are there similarities? Where are there differences? And one of the benefits for the Muslim also is that you're already engaging in the struggle that you always are engaged in, and sometimes you benefit from the other as well because they have a perspective, or they focused on something that you didn't focus on. They caught something that you missed. And so now you're working together, not against each other to disprove and debunk and convert, but rather to grow together towards Allah through these divine words that He set down. The problem with this kind of attitude or this kind of rhetoric is that sometimes people come away thinking that this is pluralism. What you're saying then is that the Christians' faith and the Jews' faith and the Sunnis' faith are all the same as Ahlul Bayt, and you're saying you no need to convert, no need to cross over. Just continue as a Christian, continue as a Sunni, and you keep moving forward, I'll keep moving forward, and we'll meet Allah at the end as a Sunni, Christian, Shi'i. That's not the case. Obviously there's a difference, and there are many differences and very crucial differences between the different you can say versions of deen that people have been able to preserve at different levels. And those are important differences, those are fundamental differences. If I knowingly reject any part of that faith, if I know something to be true and revealed by God and I reject it knowingly, then I'm forfeiting any salvation. I can't achieve salvation if I know that something's right and I reject it. But that's a different situation from somebody sincerely thinking that the Bible is truth and this is the Word of God, trying to get closer to Allah through the only truth that they know. And now I, as a Muslim who also know that Islam and teachings of Ahlul Bayt are the only truth, and that whatever's in the Bible, there are seeds of truth, there are kernels of truth that are still there, but there's much that's been changed. But now interacting in the best way that we can, sincerely trying to get closer to Allah through those texts. One of the benefits that other person will receive, not only are we both growing and becoming better people, but then they're also they have an attitude now of softness, of open-mindedness. I had an interaction recently, so I've been trying to practice this, I mentioned earlier. Over the past year or so, I reconnected with an old roommate of mine from college. So he was a Christian who became evangelical Christian in college, while I reconnected with my Islamic heritage. And we both started to learn, and we both went off to seminary. And now after 25 years, we both landed in Chicago. He's a pastor of a Presbyterian church, and I'm out here doing my work. And so we reconnected, and I presented these ideas and Sheikh Shamali's book, and I said, can we interact on this basis? Let's get together on a regular basis and talk about God through our respective traditions. And so we started this process, and it's been wonderful. Because again, we already have a long-standing friendship of 25 plus years, almost 30 years that we've known each other. And now we're endowed with strong education from our own traditions. And now we are interacting sincerely, trying to get closer to God through these texts that He's given us. And one of the things that I saw in our last conversation was that we were talking about attributes. That was the whole idea. Let's talk about attributes of God from each tradition. I brought a hadith of one of the imams. He brought a passage from one of Christian scholars. And at the end he said, next time we didn't get to oneness, and I'm still struggling with the Trinity, let's talk about the oneness of God next time. And so he himself proposed that as the topic. Let's focus on how we understand oneness of God. And he made himself vulnerable and said, I myself am struggling with the Trinity. As a Presbyterian minister, the Trinity is part of their dogma, but he was willing to make that sort of an admission to me, very not casual, but very, very sincerely, that he's struggling with this. Whereas if I had come, guns blazing, saying, here's why the Trinity is wrong, here's why, here's where the Bible says this, and that's why it's wrong, and this is what Paul says, this is why it's wrong. And if I pinned him down, then I'm very doubtful that would be the interaction. More likely he would try to defend rather than trying to open up and become vulnerable and understand. And it's not only one way, it's not only that he benefited, I also benefit. Another one of the things that I admire him and his tradition for, we are very blessed to have du'as of our imams and of the Prophet. So we have such a literature of du'as. Sometimes what happens is, while we're benefiting from the du'as and reciting the received du'as, we forget to make our own du'as, or we don't make the effort to now put that into my own words and let I myself have a conversation with Allah with my own words, using the inspiration of Ahlul Bayt, but I can say it on my own, in my own language, sincerely talk to Allah. Because sometimes the received du'as end up becoming ritualistic. I might recite du'a kumail regularly, but I never bother reflecting on it or thinking about the meaning or looking at the translation. But it's just something I have to do every Thursday night. It's like clockwork. I do it, and there's a reward for it. But it's not a sincere. It's not a kind of a heart. I don't want to say heart to heart, but a heartfelt du'a to Allah, where I myself am speaking my own needs and my own praise of Him, my own gratitude to Him. I'm using Imam Ali's words, and I'm keeping a distance. As in Arabic, it's too much trouble to look at the translation. Or I've looked at the translation, let me just read the Arabic now and not really focus on the meaning anymore. And it becomes a ritual. Whereas in the Christian tradition, at least the Protestant Christian tradition, they have a very strong emphasis on speaking your own prayers. And so when you sit down, this old roommate of mine, when you sit down for a meal every month, the first thing that we do is offer a dua, offer a prayer before we eat. So he set the tone the first time, and he said a very beautiful prayer. And so the next time he asked me, he said, why don't you say it? And I was tempted to say, the received dua for Imam Sadiq before eating, but instead I tried to use I piggybacked off of his style, and I made my own dua. I said my own prayer, and it was a very beautiful experience. It was very challenging. It was very awkward, very difficult because it was something new. But I took inspiration from him, and I did it, and it felt very good. And I took that lesson away, that I want to try to do that more in my own dua, also speak in my own words, not only use the inspiration that we have from the received du'as of Ahlul Bayt. So there's a mutual benefit in these kinds of interactions if we approach it in this way. We're both trying to get closer to Allah. We're using the received text and tradition that we've each received. But this kind of mutual working together towards Allah opens hearts. And there's so much benefit for both sides. And if conversion happens, if someone crosses over, so be it. That's in Allah's hands. Right? Even if, we kind of take the old school method of arguing with someone and convincing them and getting them to say the Shahada, that doesn't guarantee that they're a Muslim. Legally they become Muslim. By saying Shahada, you're legally a Muslim, correct. But if the heart hasn't changed, if the person isn't sincerely submitting and trying to submit, doesn't have the attitude of Islam, then it's a superficial conversion. What's much more important, again, not to belittle that, converting, saying the Shahadatain, becoming a legal Muslim is also important. But what's more important is the actual conversion of the soul and the heart. And that is something that you can work on even before the person is even interested in converting, through this mutual working on trying to get closer to Allah. That person can stay a Christian, stay a Jew, stay a Sunni, whatever they may be, and you're working towards knowing God better and serving Him better and worshiping Him better, being more grateful to Him. That is the reality. That is the true essence of Islam in the first place. Once that has happened, once I become a better Muslim through this interaction, that person will also become a better Muslim in the sense of submission to Allah, then the conversion of saying Shahadatain is a very easy thing. That happens, that can happen at any time. But the hard work of actually becoming a better person and a person closer to Allah and more devoted to Allah, that has already begun. And that is really the most important thing. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصلي لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر صلوات الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد والثناء لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد بن عبد الله وعلى علي المرتضى وعلى فاطمة الزهراء والحسن والحسين وعلي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة بن الحسن القائم المهدي صلوات الله عليهم أجمعين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أوصيكم مرة أخرى بتقوى الله واتباع أمره. Once again, I remind all of us to try to foster the fear of Allah, taqwa of Allah, constant reverence of Him, which is a factor of knowing Him. إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء tells us that the khashya of Allah comes from knowing God. And the better I know Him, the more fear I'll have of Him, the more taqwa I'll have of Him. I'll share let me share one anecdote actually, and then we'll close from there. We have in the Quran this verse in Surah Al-Nahl, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'izati al-hasana," where Allah is commanding us to call people to the path of God. "Ud'u ila sabili rabbik bil hikma wal maw'izati al-hasana," with wisdom and with good admonishment. This is the inspiration for what we call da'wah. Da'wah, which is to call people to the faith. It manifests itself in different ways in different times, different cultures. We talked about debating and arguing and that kind of an attitude where you come to someone and you try to convince them that they're wrong and convince them that you're right. That had a time and a place, and maybe it will have a time and a place later in history as well. But currently this is not a very effective way of talking to people about deen. It's not hikmah right now. If a person comes to you and the people come knocking at your door trying to give you literature about a faith or to discuss with you about their faith and why they're right and you're wrong, we don't welcome them into our homes. Not just because we're Muslim, nobody likes it. Nobody feels comfortable with these people. The people who come in your face and they want to challenge you and argue and tell you things, it doesn't rub us the right way. And it's something that really puts you off of whatever they're saying because you feel like they're very aggressive and they're perhaps manipulative, and it doesn't feel like a sincere interaction. But it's not that this is always the case. It depends on time and place. So we see in even the hadith of the A'imma, even in the Prophet's time, we see that debates were carried out. We have many hadith which take place and they're narrating the story of a debate between an atheist and, for instance, Hisham ibn al-Hakam. He was one of the important debaters from the 6th and 7th Imam's companions. And so those whole debates are narrated, and they were effective because these were people who were coming out publicly and challenging the existence of God and challenging the faith. And this was a real threat for people, and so it was necessary for someone to fight fire with fire and come out and argue with them on their terms to debunk that person, silence that person, and give people more confidence in the faith that they had, and not to be dissuaded and swerved from the truth by this person who was articulating these ideas of unbelief. So there may be room for that, there may be places for that still relevant now, but in our daily interactions with others, this is not a wise, hakim way of interacting with our peers and our neighbors and people around us, to come out guns blazing trying to debunk and to debate and to establish through this kind of argument. But the other extreme is also not good enough. Sometimes we try to be so soft that we may live a lifetime with people and they never even realize that we're Muslim, or they never even realize what we believe and what we stand for, because we're so concerned about hiding and just getting along and not ruffling feathers and those kinds of things, that we don't do our job to at least expose them to the truth that we know that we have. So both extremes are inappropriate. And we need to have, find ways to interact with people. And at the end of the day, we're responsible for doing what we can to guide people. Imagine on the Day of Judgment, if Allah questions that co-worker, that neighbor, that person that you had interactions with but never exposed any part of your deen with that person. If He questions that person and says, why did you not believe in Islam? And he said, I never knew anything about Islam. You had that neighbor, you had that co-worker who was Muslim. Didn't he ever teach you? No, he never mentioned anything. That person may get off the hook. If he did the best he could with whatever truth he had, he followed the Bible as best he could because that's all he knew to be the truth, and he was a truth seeker and he lived and died with the truth that he knew. He didn't know anything better. Why? Because I failed. He may be off the hook, but I won't be off the hook. I will be responsible for my neglect in ever teaching him anything, ever talking to him about anything. And so that should bring the reality home that we can't take it so easy. Yes, we don't want to be forceful. Yes, we don't want to be aggressive. We don't want to be argumentative. It should be with hikmah and with good maw'idha that we interact with people. This way that I was talking about in the first khutbah, I think, is a very good manifestation of that is very appropriate now, where I am sincerely trying to know God better. And if you are willing, you also join me in this pursuit, and let's know God better through our own traditions, and let's learn from each other, let's work together to know God better. Now, hearts are opened, minds are opened, good practices are being exchanged, and there's a real chance not only that I'm going to become a better person through this interaction, but there's a great chance that person is going to become a better person. And then if Allah guides him to actual conversion to Islam and saying the Shahadatain and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, then that's an additional bonus. But the reality of submitting to Allah is already there through this meaningful and sincere interaction. So that's something we can all work on through our interactions with others. And again, we will be the beneficiaries, and then we can stand before Allah on the Day of Judgment and say we did our best to try to not only practice the faith, but also to spread the word in the best way that we could. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. We ask you, Allah, to forgive all of the believers who have passed away. We ask you to forgive all of the believers amongst us and anywhere in the world. Have mercy on those who are suffering and relieve their suffering. Destroy those who are causing their suffering. Alleviate that dhulm and bring the zalimeen to justice. We ask you, Allah, to open our hearts to more knowledge and to coming closer to you. We ask you to give us confidence in our own deen and the wisdom to deal with other people in the best way that opens their hearts and also helps them to come closer to you. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.